Okay, well, let's get started. I think it'd be fine for a few people to come in as we're doing some introductions. Welcome to this session on the changing role of health economics. Some of us have been around long enough to really see that change in role. We used to define ourselves as health maximizers. I think we're transitioning now to cost minimizers. And I think we'll be discussing some of the reasons for that, hopefully, in this session. I have an excellent panel with me here today. I have on my far left Taz Alderwood. He has 3 hats on today. He is a GP. He is a Chief Clinical Information Officer in a primary care partnership. And he is also the CEO of Tech. And that tech is called DocAbode, and it is a scheduling software used for improving urgent and emergency care. So I think we might hear a very interesting perspective, because Taz is not a health economist. I think a lot of us in this room are not health economists, so we won't be assuming any knowledge about that going forward. I also have Steve Morris here. Steve is Professor of Health Services Research at Cambridge, but importantly is also the Director of the NIHR Applied Research Collaborative for the East of England. And I have on my right over here Dr. Gurdeep Sagu, who is the kind of jobbing economist, I think, amongst us, in the sense that he is the one who's been really doing and trying to gather some of this evidence and to try to fit a square peg into a round hole in many circumstances. So what we're going to do is I'm going to invite each of the panelists to go up to the lectern and give us a short presentation. We've asked them some quite tough and searching questions for them to address. So they will do that, sometimes with slides, sometimes without. And then we will have a structured conversation. And I'll ask each of the panelists to give us their perspectives, but then I will open it up to the room for maybe 2 or 3 comments. And then we'll move on to the next topic. And then we'll have a much wider, broader Q&A session towards the end. Now we have 1 hour and 20 minutes, which is a very long time for a discussion around health economics straight after lunch. So I think what we'll do is we would ask you respectfully to kind of stay in your seats, I guess, for another 45 minutes or so. But anyone after that, for any reason, who feels that it's time for them to drift off and to cool their head off, please feel free to do so after that. So I won't stop the conversation at 2:30 if we're kind of, it feels like it's still hot. But if we're all kind of beginning to fade and we would like it all to come to an end, then please feel that you can leave, and I'll also close it down earlier so we can have more time for networking. So that's it. We have no housekeeping. I don't think we're expecting a fire alarm or anything like that. So, yes, I think we will start with you, Steve. If you would like to go to the lectern, you should have a speaker.
Thanks very much, Hannah-Rose. So this is probably the most fun you're going to have today, right? So, because it's all about health economics. So I'm just going to give you some thoughts about changing role of economics in the NHS, just some perspectives from my point of view. So I'm an academic, so I get involved in a lot of often NIHR funded research. And I'm really kind of into getting stuck into the methodological detail, and I love things like probabilistic sensitivity analysis and all these things that people at NICE get really carried away on, and sometimes I think there's a pressure on people like me to say, well, hang on, hold your horses, just try and be a little bit more pragmatic, and that's, I guess, one of the things that it would be good to try and talk a little bit about today. I should also add that one of the reasons why I'm here is because I am one of the economists involved in the NIHR Rapid Service Evaluation Team, the RESET one. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 things. So economic evaluation versus financial analysis and the relative use and usefulness of those. I'll talk a little bit about my kind of perspectives on, from an economic evaluation point of view, what kind of evidence is useful and works and what doesn't work. I'll talk a little bit about what I think the system needs, but also what it's asking for, not necessarily the same thing, and also what economists can do better. So that's my talk. So first thing, just to kind of fix ideas. So as an academic, when I get involved in my nice kind of 5-year NIHR programme grants, the thing that I'm really interested in doing is being involved alongside a clinical trial and doing a nice economic evaluation. And the question there that we're really asking is, do we think this particular innovation is worth it? Is it good value for money? And so we're interested in saying, well, what are the costs of this innovation compared with some comparator? And then what are the benefits defined in some particular way? And usually, and the economist in the room will know this, the non-economist might not, but the metric we often use is the incremental cost per quality gained, which is an example of an incremental cost events ratio. And usually then we're interested in looking at health outcomes, and often we need to do some economic modelling to try and project what the longer term outcomes might be beyond the end of the follow-up in a trial. And really then, so my job as an academic health economist really is to try and quantify what the costs and the benefits are of this particular innovation compared with some alternative. And then the question is then, how does that measure of the balance of costs and benefits compared to an alternative? And that often affects, and ultimately that might be used to make a judgment on, well, is this thing worth investing in the system? So that's in contrast to the financial analysis, which often says, or a bit like a budget impact analysis, actually, can we afford to do this thing? Okay, so it's focusing a lot more on the budget impact, cash flow, looking at affordability and the bottom line in terms of profits and losses. And often it's thinking about what the real costs might be to the health service or broader from implementing this, and what does this do to our budget. So it's a slightly different perspective, and often this informs procurement and contract decisions. And often, so you might have something where it's very cost effective in this column, but actually it's not affordable in this column. And that's the kind of tension, I guess, one of the tensions in the room today. So in terms of the next question then, for me, what lands and what doesn't in terms of the stuff that I produce? So I'm being quite, well, this is, I don't know, well, let's see what you think about this. So the type of stuff that we do, particularly in my work as part of the rapid service evaluation team, often we're comparing new pathways against some comparison. We might do a detailed analysis of the cost of the intervention, and then we might try and define what a particular pathway might look and allocate some costs to that. And so we're doing some rapid economic modelling and then making some assumptions, then trying to validate those. Now, particularly our work in rapid evaluation, I can't think of a situation. So I'd like to think that the scenario would be that we're being asked to evaluate something, and the decision maker is at a fork in the pathway saying, well, shall we do this? Shall we implement this or not? And your study is going to be really useful in informing that decision. Right, that's where I would like to think our work sits, but I can't think of a rapid evaluation project we've done that actually does sit there. It's normally, well, probably we're going down here. Can you just do a bit of economics to help beef that up and to try and look at the case? And so in my experience, when things land well is when we end up doing economic analyses that end up confirming what the decision maker might hope for, which might be invest or it might not. And so, because often, yes, the things we've done, there is already a very clear direction of travel as to what's being done, which is quite tricky from my point of view. And when things land less well is when the evidence is inconclusive or mixed and very uncertain, and we maybe come back to this in the discussion. A lot of the work that we do, there is a lot of uncertainty in it. We might have a best, least unbiased estimate, but there is uncertainty, and it's what we then do then. Especially when there's already a commitment to being involved in a particular innovation. So that is the kind of my takeaway in terms of that particular point. So in terms of economic analyses, what do I think, next kind of idea for me is, what does the system really want? Well, I think, yeah, so this is a rapid evaluation conference, and for sure, fast turnaround is often, in terms of when, for the rapid service evaluation team, that's always the thing that we're looking for. And that's often a bit in contrast to some of the bigger projects that I'm involved with, so things like programme grants funded by the NIHR, which have a very long application time and then a long time to run. So they last for several years. Also, as well as claims about cost effectiveness, it's pretty clear that really what people know is what the financial analysis, so what's the bottom line budget impact analysis. And also, and that sort of fits into commissioning, and like I said, slightly cynically, sort of what the system, in my opinion, often does want is this idea about sort of evidence to enforce a direction of travel that they're already keen to do. And so that helps with faster adoption of innovations, being involved in decisions, but there are some risks in terms of all of this. In terms of uncertainty, and that's, again, something that I found, it's about how do we account for uncertainty in the work that we do, and how do people making decisions actually understand that and take that into account. And also, again, this might come out in the discussion later, there's some concerns about speed favouring more optimistic assumptions. And often when, in my experience, when I can think back some of the studies that we've done, again with some of the people in the room, we've done evaluations which haven't been quite as optimistic as others, as the people asking have done, and we haven't really ever heard any more about those evaluations. So how can economists better work with the NHS? So earlier on, so being involved right at the start, rather than this is the direction of travel we're going down already, can the economists then come in to help shore this up? So early discussions with some discussions around co-design evidence and some expectation management. So thinking about uncertainty and being honest about the uncertainty that's involved. I think that's something that, as economists, I spend a lot of my time trying to flag. There's what the uncertainties are here. And then the difficulty, though, is how do decision makers actually account for that? So just really, really crudely, if you think in very simple terms, if I said, so this is our estimate of cost effectiveness, and then we've got, but it could be this or it could be this. How is someone supposed to, who doesn't really know much about economics, how is someone supposed to account for that uncertainty in decision where often you just have a threshold? So that's a problem that several of us are wrestling with at the minute. There can be more about shared infrastructure in terms of modelling and data. And also, I think there is something about rewarding studies that are well done, even if they don't necessarily give a certain answer. So that's my thoughts. Looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts on those later. Thank you.
Gurdeep, could I ask you to go up the spectrum? Give us your perspective.
Brilliant. Yes. So I should make the disclaimer that I'm going to be talking about NICE, but I'm not employed by NICE, so any mistakes are my own. Also, I'm funded by the NIHR, but also, again, any mistakes are my own. So my views do not represent what NICE believe or say, and the same, they don't represent what the NIHR views are. So at Newcastle University, I am co-leader of the Health Economics Group. So I do a lot of the same types of work that Steve was talking about in terms of the NIHR-funded program grants or trials. So these longer evaluations but I'm also co-director of the Newcastle Technology Appraisal Review Group, and we undertake evaluations for NICE. So we evaluate both drugs and health tech, and so it's that bit that I'm going to be focusing on. So NICE have, over the last 3 or 4 years, have redeveloped or redefined their evaluation processes, and they're trying to be a lot more agile and reactive. And one of the programs that they've set up was the early value assessment, so EVA or EVA, which has very recently been changed to early use assessment. So I'm going to try and say early use assessment, but I may accidentally slip into EVA and early value assessment. And the idea behind the early use assessments is to evaluate technologies that can address a national unmet need. And the idea is we want to try and evaluate these quickly, so rapidly, and also early in their life cycle, where evidence may be more sparse. But I agree with Steve when he was saying that, you know, ideally in that fork in the junction, you want to be doing it at the base of that junction, but for these technologies that have been identified, we're slightly moving towards a need that's been identified, and that's why we're going to be looking at these technologies. And so through NICE and their prioritization boards, they're able to identify these topics, these technologies, and the idea is that we try and evaluate those. So we want to try and evaluate whether these technologies have the potential to be clinically effective, but also then cost effective, so offer value for money to the NHS, and then try to, because they're early in their development and there's limited data and greater uncertainty, we want to try and identify where those evidence gaps are, so that once NICE make their decision, we can try and prioritise where and how we fill those evidence gaps to reduce the uncertainty. So NICE had a pilot phase where they identified 10 sets of technologies. So they undertook 10 pilot projects. 6 of those were digital technologies. And the idea was that the from scoping to guidance production would take roughly 6 months, which is significantly quicker than quite a lot of previous NICE evaluations and guidance. But the time that the external assessment group, so teams like myself, we have to do our bit within 8 weeks. So it's quite quick, quite rapid. So it was interesting to hear that some of the rapid work earlier from the first session was 2 months to 12 to 18 months. So this is definitely in the quicker end. The idea is that we try and evaluate both the clinical and the cost effectiveness of these technologies. So some of it is us going out and trying identifying evidence from the literature, or borrowing evidence from somewhere else which is applicable to the decision problem that we have. And some of it's the companies providing evidence, and that may be published or unpublished. Now, NICE are hoping to be able to make quick recommendations, but the goal, I think, here is to try and enable earlier adoption and then collecting real-world evidence to fall in line with NICE's real-world evidence framework. So they're very much open to the collection of that evidence. As part of this process, there is an evidence generation plan that is produced, and the aim there is to try and, as I said, reduce uncertainty, but it's time-bound. So recommendations can be made, but they're made for a 3-year period, and the evidence generation plans are aiming to try and guide companies or technology producers to try and collect evidence within that 3-year period so that the technologies can be re-evaluated after that point. And so eagle-eyed of you, so 22-23 means these technologies are coming back roughly now. And so we've actually seen, or we're about to see, the first couple of these technologies coming back in for a re-evaluation. So it's going to be interesting to see in the next 6 months to a year how well this evidence generation plan pipeline has worked. As part of the early use assessments, NICE can make 3 conditional recommendations. So they're not full recommendations, they're conditional. It can be conditionally recommended for use whilst this further evidence is generated. It can be recommended in research only, or it could be not recommended for use. In reality, what we're seeing is that the vast majority of these technologies through these early use assessments are being conditionally recommended for use whilst evidence is generated through the evidence generation plan. Now, this is a figure that I've taken from Lovell et al., which is published in the International Journal of Health and Technology, Technology Assessment in Healthcare. I should know that name because I'm a deputy editor for that journal, but we call it ISHTAG, so I've never committed the full name to memory. But there are 2 papers published in that journal, and this is Lovell et al., and what this figure is trying to show is that in the evidence generation plans that have been produced, this is the frequency of these uncertainties. So you can see that resource use, adverse events, and long-term clinical effectiveness data are missing in quite a few, and so they're mentioned in the evidence generation plan. And so it's not necessarily a criticism of the technologies because they are fairly early on in their development. So we would expect to see or not see long-term clinical effectiveness because the evidence is literally not there because they're quite new. So hopefully by the end of the 3-year evidence generation plans, we can see a further 3 years of evidence. And so before I talk about this slide, I was also asked to talk about an exemplar project. So very recently, a nice early use assessment has been produced into guidance earlier this month, and it was on digital technologies for supporting the self-management of asthma. And this is one that we did in Newcastle. There were 9 technologies included within this. Out of the 30 or so assessments that have taken place, I think only 2 or 3 have focused on a single technology. So they all tend to be multi-technology appraisals. This one included 9 technologies. In order to get into an early use assessment, you have to have UK CE or UK CA marking and DTAC if it's relevant. So there is a process to get into this, but otherwise it's nice trying to pull technologies into this process. With the asthma example, we identified very little evidence. So I think across the 9 technologies, we identified something like 20 papers that looked at the clinical effectiveness to varying extents. I think there was 1 or 2 very small randomized control trials using these technologies. We looked at the economic evidence. I think we identified something like 5 studies that may be relevant, that give us a little bit of information. So we had to build a model for ourselves. We built a model which looks far more complex than it actually is, but the idea was that we focused on uptake of the technology because we realized that not everyone will want to use the technology. There may be reasons for not using it. We looked at dropout rates, so if someone starts using the technology and then decides they really don't like it, at what point would they drop out and what that dropout rate would look like and what impact it would have. And then the key things we looked at were exacerbation. So when someone has an asthma attack, how good is the technology at preventing that? And also how good is the control state of asthma? And that varies, so it can be well controlled, fully controlled, partially controlled, not controlled at all. So there are different levels. And so we had to I would say we did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the assumptions that we were making because of the lack of evidence. But essentially the key things were the cost of the technologies. So we had some technologies that were relatively free in terms of there were apps that you could download. Now, nothing's ever really free. So there were some costs associated with those applications, but essentially the app itself was free. And then there were some that had an upfront cost of a few £100, and this is all publicly available, and then had return fees as well, if it included a device or not, so spirometer. And so the key things that drove decision making were cost of devices, but also actually how well they helped the individual to manage symptoms and to remain in a well-controlled state. Now, I don't know if there are any asthmatics in the audience, but you don't tend to have an exacerbation or a really serious exacerbation very often. So it's a relatively rare event. So when you blow this up onto a population, you know, ICB scale or a national population level, you know, there are still relatively few exacerbations, and that's the big, you know, driver in terms of, is it working as intended? You know, is it providing that benefit? So these are the tensions that we have when we're doing some of these evaluations. Now, I've talked about the evidence generation plans, really important, and one of the good things that NICE and the NHS have worked together to try and do is to try and help the companies develop this evidence. And so they've put together a research call, so funding specifically to try and address this gap. It's an Eye for Eye Program Development Award, specifically aimed at these technologies. So the idea is you generate real-world evidence whilst the technology is being used. Your technology has to have been approved through that program to be eligible for this call. But also, very importantly, it needs to be a consortium of analytical partner. So someone doing the evaluation, quite often an academic group, but sometimes consultancies, the technology partner, but also NHS partners. So it's really trying to bring the key players together to try and generate evidence that can then feed back into the re-evaluation. I think that is my last slide.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So we've heard from Steve about, I want you to hold in your mind this difference between financial and economic evaluation or analysis. We've just heard from Gadeep about the way his team produces what I think would be on these in this spectrum on the side of economics evaluation, so producing ICEs. Is that right?
Yeah.
So now we're going to hear from Taz, who I think is going to be talking about the generation of evidence probably on the other end of the spectrum. I'm guessing, but that's where I think we're going.
Yeah.
Taz, over to you.
Well, just for a clarification, I actually left my Chief Clinical Information Officer post last month at the ICB. So I'm going to be candid, but I'm going to be safe and stick to a script as well, because I didn't want to be too candid. So I want to come at this from a very different angle, and kind of most of what I come across in my day job is it sits very much outside of the NICE route and all the health economic stuff. We sell through procurement frameworks, we sell directly into ICBs and trusts, but the rapid valuation challenge is in a different setting with very different incentives, without any of that sort of methodological scaffold that you've heard from Steve and Gurdeep today. So I'm in a slightly unusual position in this panel. I kind of hold sort of three different sides of the conversation. So I'm a GP, so I kind of understand the clinical end of what these innovations are meant to enable. We've heard things like ambient voice today. Obviously, CSAIR, West Yorkshire ICB up until last month. So I was on the buyer side and commissioning innovation up in West Yorkshire, and reading vendor business cases, rejecting some of them. I'm also been a founding CEO of my health tech business, which you heard about earlier, which was turned 10 years actually last weekend. So I'm trying to look at all three angles here, and the more I think about this sort of evidence quality and how it's framed, it kind of misses some of the deeper problems, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I want to start with Steve's two categories, because most of what we're asked for in procurement sits squarely in the financial column. None of the finance directors want to know in-year cash ROI, they want to know budget impact, contracted productivity uplifts that they can hold us to. The economic cost per quality stuff, that is national stuff. NHS England, I did work at NHS England, by the way, for about 5 years. Other national areas and policy, but not procurement, deal with all the quality stuff. But I think there's something missing in the column, which is around, and I think the formal literature sort of underweighs this, which is operational evidence. But what I mean with that is, will this work in my service in the first week? Will it take, 3 weeks to train a Band 7 manager to use this product? Will the technical integration survive, production loads? These are the sort of things that really matter. And it's the category that makes clinical and operational directors say yes or no, never mind the economic case as well. So we spend a lot more energy producing operational evidence than any of the other two categories combined. And it's possible that the rapid evaluation community hasn't fully reckoned with how much weight procurement and trust deal with operational impact stuff and how they then create the financial metrics from that. So to make that a bit more concrete, in my own personal journey, we were grant funded through something called Small Business Research Initiative back in 2016, and actually had 3 phases of that funding, which was over £1.5 million worth of public money, peer reviewed at every stage. It was mandated to have evidence. It was mandated to have health economic analysis. We did that with Health Economics Unit. We're doing that with UCL partners right now. And we deployed across, in fact, all the London trusts here in North London use our software in Dockabode. And the figures that were cited from these evaluations show productivity uplifts. They modelled a 76.3 million annual saving across London region. But there's 2 things I want to say about that and be honest about it. That £76.3 million releasing figure was resting on operational data that was very, very hard to come by. And that's from UCLP and our teams as well. We spent weeks trying to get this information out of trust systems that didn't talk to each other. None of it was data linked. And you couldn't calculate true costs like cost per contact. When I'd asked the finance director, the baseline, where are we starting from? Because we want to show that improvement. It was just very, very difficult because actually things like cost per contact in the pathways we work in, which are things like urgent community response, that depends on whether the visit was made by an agency worker or an employed nurse, what time of the day, the complexity of the patient, and those variables were just not joined up anywhere. So when we cite the productivity figure, and what I mean by that, it's the best estimate that can be produced from operational data that the NHS itself struggles to assemble. Secondly, this is where the rapid evaluation framing sometimes misses the texture of how adoption actually happens. That formal hierarchy of evidence really is underweighed because the NHS adoption cycle runs on case studies, peer recommendations, warm introductions from one director of ops to another. The NHS doesn't like to be sold to. What moves the conversation is one trust telling another what happened in that service, and we often work alongside trust to help shape the business case because it's the operational and clinical staff who see the value most clearly, but they aren't always the ones to have the time or headspace to write the compelling case for finance committee. So that evidence to adoption pathway is more social than methodological. And any rapid evaluation framework that doesn't account for that will underpredict what actually moves the system. Here's where I want to push the conversation a bit harder. If you ask me how tech providers and the NHS should work together to produce credible, rapid evidence, the honest answer is that better methodology won't actually fix what's actually broken, because the deeper problem isn't the vendor evidence quality. The deeper problem is that the NHS has structural disincentives to adopting things like productivity improving innovations in the first place. Let me give you some examples. Block contracts that cap activity. We were measuring productivity in a trust and we realised it had plateaued, and we asked why, despite lots of capacity being in the system, that they said there was no incentive for that provider to take on more demand if the contract doesn't pay for it. So a productivity improving innovation that lets you see more patients per shift in many block contracted services is commercially irrelevant. That could reflect on us as an innovation when you see some of these numbers that you can't explain. Secondly, we then discovered trusts were making business cases to ICBs to say, using these very low productivity figures, we need X million of pounds to hire more staff to do what we're always doing, to see more patients. So actually bringing a high impact innovation in that improves productivity and all that, it doesn't help with the case, actually undermines the case when trusts are in a financially difficult position. And third, and everyone in this room probably knows this, but it's the kind of cross-system saving misalignment. It works somewhere, say in a community trust where we're embedded, and the savings are elsewhere. So we know our innovation improves the ambulance trust. It improves ED 4-hour response time, referral to treatment time, all these savings. So the trust that actually pays for it doesn't get the benefit, so why do you bother? And no amount of methodology, evaluation methodology will fix that. This is sort of architecture of incentives across the systems that has to change. So, and it's no reflection of the rapid evaluation community. It's just we've been asked to, and well, recognise we've been asked to innovate in a system that has structural reasons to reject it, regardless of the evidence. So what would help? 3 things very briefly. Metric standardisation. So what I mean by that is we don't have a unified definition, in our example, of productivity across various pathways. And every ICS and every trust, even every service, measures it differently. One trust measures a double up as 1 contact, that's when 2 patients have to come, and another service within the same trust measures that as 2 contacts. How many patients do you see per hour? Does that reflect case complexity, quality, downstream emission avoidance? Until we measure everything consistently, you can't really compare things, and that's not a valid comparison. So that's really important. Having shared operational data as a contract condition, because the counterfactual of any savings claim rests on something the vendor and the evaluator can actually see. We've heard all this morning about how difficult it is to access that data. The independent evaluation infrastructure. So the genuine question is whether the infrastructure is currently structured to publish negative findings. And I'm glad to say this morning people talked about that. And it's not just negative. In fact, Johnny, we were talking about this earlier this morning. It's not just saying this doesn't work, this innovation. Actually saying, well, in this subset of patients it does work, but it doesn't in that. And that's really important because we want to double down. One, find out why it doesn't work in those, but maybe why it does in these subsets of populations. And both are really valuable. So I'm going to just move on to probably something Hannah Rose will push me on later. But the pressure on companies like mine to produce positive economic story is absolutely enormous. Every layer of the funding stack rewards optimistic models. Whether you're VC-backed, due diligence, SBRI, scoring even to get onto that, it rewards really good economic claims. And the NHS procurement team asks, well, how much are you going to save us in year? How will we, but instead they should be asking, how will we know whether you have saved us? In-year ROI is a hard requirement in NHS contracts now. If you're not proving you can have an in-year ROI, you immediately did get discarded. And that's due to annual financial cycles, political pressure. A 5-year savings projection, however honest, doesn't help the Commissioner try to balance this year's budget. So all that timeline that you talk about, Gurpreet, about years of trying to get that evidence, they just want to know now how much money cash releasing you're going to save. So vendors build models to land savings in year 1, if at all possible, and by compressing the savings curve to fit that financial cycle. We're not exempt as if this is a company. I'd love to tell you that we lead with our sort of commercial conversations, operational outcomes, and savings cases will follow. But we've tried it. It slows procurement because the business case is the first thing that we get asked, and those numbers need to be presented up front. So we produce one. And it's not the fix isn't asking vendors to be more virtuous. It's changing what the system's asking for. And just briefly, just from the buyer seat that I recently occupied, what makes me trust an economic case from a company is they hand you a model that you can stress test the assumptions, not sliders that only go one way. They cite evaluators who would have plausibly said no. So we're in good company here with a lot of them who do say that. And they're very specific about what they didn't measure. And I guess the blunt version with kind of both seats on is trust companies that have published things that didn't help them, because that helps everyone. I'll stop there. I think the useful perspective is really just those different sort of sides of the conversation, really, and why that gap between the modelled and what realised matters, and the methodology of evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As in any good health economics conversation, what we're going to do now is try to ask you to hold lots of quite competing ideas in your head at exactly the same time. So we've got this idea of, economics and financial information across the panel. We've got the idea of a national decisions versus kind of regional or local or even hyper-local at the kind of clinician to clinician level. And we also have the idea of decisions that need to be made in year and what Taz was talking about, and those longer term decisions that are being taken at the national level. So you need to hold all of that in your head at exactly the same time as we continue with this conversation, which I'm sure you all can. What we're going to do now is to try and think about a few key issues that have been raised today. And the first one is around speed and credibility and robustness of analysis. So how do we think about what kind of evidence is good enough? We have the kind of evidence that Taz is talking about, which is very much to do with finance, and then we have this national level evidence, which is to do with understanding, is it worth it, as Steve mentioned. So I'm going to turn to you first, Gurdeep, on this, because you're the one closest to trying to bridge the gap between robust evidence and fast evidence. And I'd really like to kind of get your views about what works in practice in this and what you think the trade-offs are.
Yeah, so I will start by saying it depends.
Perfect health economist answer, by the way.
So I think credibility quite often trumps speed. I think, so speaking from the NICE perspective, in the committee there is a lot of push as to what is realistic, what is believable, and there are clinical experts, specialist committee members within the committee who help to inform the decision making, and we do quite often get pushback in terms of, this is an over optimistic, so we believe it more likely to be this, and so what impact does that have on the ISA that is being presented, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or cost per quality, as NICE likes to use. I think it also depends on whether we're thinking about health tech or whether we're thinking about medicines. So if we're thinking about medicines, speed is not important. We want to make sure that it's safe, that it's effective, first and foremost, and then we start thinking about value for money. If we're thinking about health tech, the timelines get shrunk down anyway. We're much more agile. We're able to make decisions much more quickly. So speed happens, but then it boils down to credibility. So can we believe the evidence that is being presented? So is it observational? Is it retrospective? Is it just modelling? Is it observational, or is it interventional? What study designs are being used? What outcomes are being shown? Are these hard clinical outcomes? Are they productivity gains, losses? What is the outcome that's actually being assessed and being shown to be positive, or positively influenced by the use of the technology? The other thing I will say is, so NICE have adopted a life cycle approach, so they try and evaluate technologies at different points in its life cycle. So early use was the when it's relatively novel, and there's little evidence, but then NICE have also got an existing use assessment program and a routine use assessment program as well, and they're both geared up to do slightly different things. So after the 3-year evidence generation plan, they go into the existing use assessment program where a more thorough evaluation is done. So we get, in terms of NICE and health tech, we get multiple bites at the cherry. So I think it does help with that speed versus credibility.
Because the credibility can build
Build
with
over
each
time.
cycle.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful because you're building it in a structured way, because you've had a look at where the uncertainty is, where it's meaningful, where it isn't meaningful, where it impacts on decision making, and so you can focus the evidence generation on that to reduce that the meaningful uncertainty.
Thanks. Steve, can I turn to you with the same question? The kind of trade-off between speed and credibility in your work, both in the longer term studies that you do, but also in your work in the rapid cycle evaluation?
I think the evidence just needs to be fit for the decision that you're using it for, and that could be in a variety of different things. So I think it partly comes down to the cost involved and the stakes involved in making a decision, and how how easy it might be to reverse if you wanted to, versus, so you can imagine if there's something that's relatively low stakes that could be undone fairly straightforwardly, rapid but less robust might be okay, whereas if it's something that's high cost, high stakes, massively hard to undo, you'd want better evidence for it. I guess the other thing maybe to say is that, so I think from my point of view, the having a clearly defined question, being clear about the data and the analysis you've done, looking at doing sensitivity analysis and then being clear what the kind of limitations are, so that should happen anyway, so even if in the minimum that should be there. And I guess the downside is that saying that, so the potential downside of saying quick but not so robust is okay in certain circumstances is whether that kind of opens the door for analyses that are too heroic, I guess is the problem from my side.
And I think I'm going to guess that you're going to say, Taz, that the only kind of evidence that is credible is quick in your world.
I think for operational impact, where you've got real-time access to that data, you can have rapid evaluation. I think it is incredible to think, long-term cost effectiveness, you can do that in 6 months. That is years. It is like it's the proper way. I'm not a health economist, but the way you described for both of you, that's just not credible, looking long-term cost effectiveness in a really rapid way. I just can't imagine how, shoot me down if I'm wrong, but that just doesn't seem credible to me. Operational impact is you have data immediately.
Any quick comments from the floor anyone would like to raise at this point? Yes, in front.
Really good to hear from you guys. I work at NHS and the modelling and systems analytics team, so it's very fun to hear uncertainty being spoken about quite a lot. So we get asked to model complex programs, overlay in cohorts, interventions, mixed evidence bases. And I think you're right. Uncertainty is something we think about quite a lot, but don't always communicate it quite clearly to decision makers. And I guess, just from experience, I think we struggle sometimes to land that message, and people just opt to take the most optimistic assumption, which is stacked across cohorts, interventions, and their own sort of decisions that have been made. So I think it's just very difficult to communicate that uncertainty to people that are not familiar working with it. But it'd be great to get some further comments on that, and just generally, how do you guys land that message, or we could land that better?
So thank you. I think that's a really good point. So it seems to me there's sort of two related issues kind of wrapped up in that. So one is, how do you convey uncertainty to people? But then I don't think it's quite the same thing. There's something about, even if you convey it in a particular way so people understand the uncertainty, there's still, how do you turn it into a decision? Because often it seems to me, when you're deciding something, it could be anything, it's a kind of a binary thing, so you're doing it or not. So I'm agreeing with you. I suppose I'm extending the problem, if I can, because I might understand what the uncertainty is, and I might see, well, this is probably, I don't know what the cost implications might be, but it could be it's saving this much, or it could be actually it's going to increase cost by this much. And so you might find I can convey that, but actually, how do you actually base a decision around that to account that into? So, and it's always easy to go, well, actually, okay, so what's your central estimate? Well, I'm going to do it on that then. So another way of thinking about it in a very kind of health economist world would be, so if NICE has a cost effectiveness threshold for a point estimate, should there also be a threshold that includes an interval? So anyway, so I think it's about conveying the uncertainty, but it's also actually, how do you make a decision when your range might be, part of it might be unsatisfactory or not where you want to be, if you see what I mean. So I agree.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to move us on now. As I said, at 2:30, anyone who feels that they need to stretch their legs or for whatever reason they need to leave, please feel free to do so from now on. I want to pick up again about this NHS savings narrative. We've all talked about that. We all understand the political and policy context within which economic and financial analysis are happening. So what we've seen recently, especially around AI and tech, are studies, health economic studies, that have shown enormous savings over a long periods of time. I mean, sometimes tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of pounds, going to save the NHS. And I guess, are we collectively kind of overselling a lot of these tech and AI initiatives? So I guess I wanted a little bit of understanding from the panel, a bit, but why you think there is such a drive for us now to be showing cost savings, and how often in the real world are those savings realised? I'm going to go to you first, Steve, if I may.
Thank you. Well, I think Taz actually said it really eloquently, talking about at the end about his kind of the business side of things, where there's a kind of an incentive to show, otherwise you don't kind of get in the door. So I guess that's the driver behind that. So the study that I would really, really love to do, but I think it would be a bit tricky to do it, would be to look at the economic case for different innovations that then went to be implemented, then to see, well, were the originally projected economic benefits, savings, were they actually materialised? And that would be a really interesting thing to do. My sense is that they might not be. And one of the reasons, I think, is because it's thinking about the real world implementation of stuff, and often that doesn't go quite as well as we might hope. So, for example, it relies on things like actually uptake and what people might do with the savings. So we've heard a lot about AVT. So like everyone else in the world, we're doing an AVT study at the minute. And what we're really interested in looking at is if there are any gains in any cost, time savings in terms of reducing documentation time. What we're really interested in is, well, what does that actually mean? So if you gain 3 minutes from an outpatient appointment, that's good. But actually, what do you do with that 3 minutes? And it might be not very much. And there's a benefit to that, obviously, because someone's having a rest, for example. So it's a meaningful thing, but it might not be a cost saving or productivity gain, because actually nothing really happens in that time. So try and understand the kind of value realisation. So I think a lot of the cost savings are not ultimately guaranteed or realised, and it's partly because it's thinking about the value realisation, I think, is what I think.
Taz?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. One of the things I can say, I've been in commissioning for 12 years, and I've never seen, after the business case has been approved and all these claims of ROI, someone actually going back and going, did we save that or not? Because I think if you add up all the tech companies, everything we all shove in there is we're going to save the NHS billions. Like the NHS would be doing very well, wouldn't it? And be saving loads and loads of money. But yeah, I think one of the challenges around the data that you underpin a lot of the financial modelling on, this is like data that has to go into national reporting data sets. And it's not a malicious thing that happens, but that data quality is very poor. And I can give you a very specific example because we live and breathe this. In this particular pathway that we work in urgent community response, the national KPI is that you have to get there within 2 hours. So that's from referral to being physically with the patient in a out-of-hospital setting. And you'll see that lots of people are doing really well because there's a certain percentage you have to get to. Obviously, when we started looking at a lot of this data, we saw when people were reporting that time of arrival, and typically it would be at the end of the day or the day after, and then it would typically be like about a minute before that KPI ran out. And the same thing happens in ED, 4-hour waits, people just being moved to departments to hit the targets and things like that. So when you've got these data, that this is higher level data, not the granular data that I get to see in some of the services and things like that, like the underpinning of that is not right. And that's because most of the staff don't have the tools to be able to do that, because in our world, pre-docker mode, it's bits of paper and WhatsApp and an Excel spreadsheet and a whiteboard. So to actually contemporaneously know that to feed your electronic patient record, so you've got an accurate timestamp, isn't there. So you're then thinking, are the services doing really well, they're not doing very well? Well, if they're getting that many people, they're hitting that target, and they've got that many whole-time equivalent staff, then we can do some productivity numbers and make some financial modelling. But what's underpinning it, and especially in community and primary care, is the data quality issue. And that is, and it's hard to call out when the trusts are sometimes your customers or the ICBs are your customers, to say, you think it's that, you think your cost per contact's this, or you think you're hitting this KPI, but can I tell you the honest truth? You want to hear the truth, because the truth might mean that business case you're putting in for more staff, you don't need it because you've got thousands of hours of underutilized capacity, for example. So there are so many uncomfortable truths around data and data quality and what underpins the financial models. And it takes a very brave person to call it out.
Gadeep, anything to add there on the uncomfortable truths and savings?
So one of the hats that I wear is I'm the health economics lead for the Health Tech Research Centre for Diagnostics and Technology Evaluation, and we talk to a lot of companies early on in their development cycle, and I almost advise them now to say these sorts of things. So we've talked about saving X many millions so many times that it's boy who cried wolf. The NHS and commissioners have almost stopped listening, because everyone now says it. And there are, as we've explained, there are incentives for why you do this. But the only other thing I would add is, so based on what Steve was saying and the study that he would like to be able to do, I think, and I'm hoping, that moving from early use assessment into existing use assessment will allow us to start doing this. It's not quite the same, but hopefully it's a step in the right direction.
Any comments from the floor? Yes.
Hi, I'm Alison. I work on the Health Foundation's NHS Productivity Commission, and a lot of what you've been saying resonates with our emerging findings. So I guess I'm going to ask a cheeky question, which is something that we're trying to weigh up, which is who needs to act on some of this? So like the fact that there's a lot of attention and focus on business cases versus benefits realisation, the fact that there isn't much kind of political appetite or will elsewhere to hear about some of these uncertainties or where innovations don't work. And I just wonder, I suppose, how much you feel this can be tackled locally by providers. Could it be like finance directors being more open to business cases that do something slightly different? Or do you feel there needs to be like a national level DHSC steer on some of this to make a difference? It's quite a broad question, but if there's any kind of reflections on who might change the picture.
So we are now going to metamorphosize into the national board for tackling these issues. We are the deciding team now. What's going to happen?
No pressure.
What do we think? I'm going to go to Taz on this. What do you think would make a difference?
Wow. I don't think there's a single level. I think there's a responsibility at each level. So at the trust level, obviously there's a business case that goes in, there's a standard template, and you kind of have an awareness of what the number needs to say. It's a SIP program, cost improvement program, they have productivity metrics, they're all like, it needs to say this, but actually, does it? If we're saying, look, it's less, there's uncertainty, we talked about it, here's some modelling, but there is a certain level of confidence interval here to say, this may or may not kind of achieve things, and it's not all down to the vendor's problem. So I think there's like a local acceptance of how these business cases get through, and that they don't have to have these massive numbers that no one ever really checks up on. So to one level. But it's also been driven by every system. Everyone has money that they have to be saving, productivity targets, and that's coming from national, regional pressure to the ICBs as well. So, and everyone just passes that on. And ultimately, is the CFO and the COOs and all this people on the ground really that have to hit these targets. So they're looking for high impact innovations. Their level of evidence gathering is dubious, to be honest. As I'm an NHS NIA fellow on the Innovation Accelerator, we have been through a very rigorous, nice, all these different things that they've done just to whittle hundreds of companies to a handful. And we fix certain problems, but a trust will go to something that someone's built, and I love frontline, I'm a clinician, I've innovated something. We had to go through health equity, health economic, the full works to get onto an IA program. Yet they'll go and find something else that's had someone's, anything that's not really gone through that rigor. And so I'd be like, well, why have an NIA program if you aren't mandating that at least you look there first at that problem? And if it's not there, I'm also on the clinical entrepreneur program as well, but that's usually earlier stage things as well. Use the things that the national teams have already built. And I know you're from NHS England as well. They're already there, but people are allowed to do whatever they want. So I don't think there needs to be anything new. We've got a program that has done independent and our patient views, assessing every technology that says they've got all these massive impacts. But NIA have gone, talk to your customers. You have to be scaled in the NHS, and it's ready for national scale.
Good.
Use what's there.
Steve?
Crikey. Well, it's hard to see. So I can see the benefit of there being some kind of national lead on some of the issues and how to, so the kind of things Taz in particular has been talking about, and some guidance on what to look for, what to take into account. But I can't help but think that often the decisions, they're about whether to accept certain evidence, are just made locally. So I think there has to be some messaging to whether it's ICBs or trusts about judging what they've got and setting standards for what you want to see, but guidance from the top, it seems to me. So I can't see how it can be anything other than a sort of two-pronged attack. And I think there's messaging, so there's messaging to the kind of businesses and startups saying, this is the kind of evidence that matters. There's making sure that those recommendations are actually what people want to know. And I guess there's a bit of work to be done for people like me and my colleagues, making sure that we focus on what people really need rather than trying to get published in good journals, that kind of thing.
Great, thanks.
I don't think I've got anything else to add. I say that and then I go on to add something. I think there are just nuances. So, I think as Steve's saying, that there needs to be some sort of national guidance, because ultimately we've got one NHS, right? And so we're trying to minimise the variation across that. But also then the local providers are providing care to a local population which may differ quite significantly from a different region. And so does it make sense to be making the same decision and providing the same services and the level of those services? It might not. So hence agreement with the top-down, bottom-up approach of, some sort of national steer, but also doing sensible things at a local level.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. Niels Peek, Healthcare Improvement Studies Institute, Cambridge. So I wonder if it makes sense to make an analogy with pharmaceuticals. It's the kind of comparison that I like to make, because, for pharmaceuticals, we've defined very clearly what we want, and we've managed to get a governance and evaluation framework that gets us there by and large. So, for instance, we don't want individual clinicians to make a decision on, is this particular pharmaceutical value for money? That's not what they should do. So we've taken that away from them, and that kind of works, right? So could we do something similar when it comes, for instance, to these decisions about technology? That decision, is this value for money for the NHS, is taken away from individual trusts, say, or ICBs, to prevent that we just keep spending more and more money on technologies without actually knowing whether they do provide value for money.
Thank you. Anybody want to comment on that particularly, or should we just move on? Maybe move on at this stage, yes.
Thank you. I think my point really follows on from that one. My name's Joe Setters. I'm an independent evaluator. Recently I was working with UCL Partners on the evaluation of Dockerboat, and prior to that I worked on the economic case studies for the participants in the NIA. And with that latter piece of work, it used to seem to me that with all of the claims that the different participants would make in any given year, they'd be saving the entire budget of the NHS. Partly just by choosing what sort of metrics they want to use, what kind of economic evaluation they want to do. And I think one additional part of this is that there are incentives on the evaluators, the health economics consultants and so on, to do things in a certain way. Sometimes that's set by the funders of the evaluations, that we want you to do an ROI, we want you to do a cost-consequence analysis, and you can make almost anything look beneficial in some way or another to one audience or another. So, is there an answer to that? Perhaps some national specification on what sort of analysis to do in any given context. If this is for a commissioner, you need to have certain kind of analysis using certain basic metrics. I mean, I wonder if that's feasible.
That's great. Thank you. Any other comments?
Pass the parcel. So, I mean, just thinking about my experience of bringing it back to evaluation, I think we've talked quite a lot about there being maybe one decision maker, but my experience is that often in evaluation there's multiple decision makers at the audience for the evaluation, and that brings more complexity to it because it might be commissioners, it might be national government, so lots of different people that perhaps want a slightly different answer and perhaps a slightly different method. But how do you deal with that, given what's been said in the previous two questions?
Yeah, Steve would like to come.
Well, so one thought, I suppose it's not really addressing Neil's point, but sort of indirectly, which is about drawing analogies elsewhere. So, but then focusing not so much on the overall process, but just on the research. So if you do a big clinical trial, big NHS funded clinical trial, you have to register that on the kind of trial registry, and you say exactly what you're going to do, and you normally would upload your protocol which says this is the primary outcome, this is how we're going to analyse it. You specify that in advance. So drawing the analogy across to learn from other things, I don't know whether there's a mechanism of doing more of that, or whether that would work, or whether that's not possible, doing things rapidly, because it just makes things very difficult. I don't know, but this kind of predefining what you're going to do, your analysis, before you have collected the data to do it and actually crunch the numbers, I don't know whether that helps with a bit more kind of rigour and robustness. I don't know. That's a thought.
Right, I think I'm going to try and draw this discussion to a close now. With my board of national team, I think we have come up with some recommendations. First of all, I think we've all heard the words honest uncertainty. I think that Steve started us off with that at the very beginning of the session, and I think that has permeated all the way through. I think we would quite like business cases to be presented within a range rather than a point estimate for cost effectiveness, so that decision makers can understand the range of of uncertainty that they're allowed to make positive decisions within. I've heard that in other fora as well as today, so I think that's something that's definitely could be coming along. Something about one front door for innovations that has had some kind of economic analysis, and that there is some national guidance around what that economic analysis needs to be, both in terms of the financial modelling, but also in terms of the economics, which is overlaps, but is, as we've discussed, is not the same thing. That decisions about value for money, I think we've heard, are taken potentially away from individual trusts as it has for other kinds of med tech and drugs, with national specifications for certain types of analysis, taking into account that there are multiple decision makers at different levels of the system who will need different levels of certainty and perhaps different kinds of analysis in order to make their decisions. And that we can learn from the evaluation of other types of med tech in terms of predefining the protocols of what it is that we are looking for when we are making decisions about what needs to be analysed. I think that's quite a good manifesto, if you don't mind me saying, for what needs to happen. I can't believe we've done that in an hour and 15 minutes. Just goes to show, doesn't it? We don't need national inquiries sometimes. We can just do it ourselves. Thank you very much to my panellists for a very deep and very complex and interesting discussion from a range of perspectives. Thank you to you all for being here and for asking very interesting and searching questions. And I will see you over tea.